When I was growing up, right at the end of the Soviet Union, the so-called bad girls were this source of complete fascination. Prostitution felt like something out of a book, a Dostoevsky novel maybe, not real life. But then came the 1990s and everything changed. Suddenly this hidden world just exploded into the open. And honestly, it showed me a side of my country that just shattered everything I thought I knew about right and wrong, survival, and even power.
I can pinpoint the exact moment this all became real for me. I was in a university cafe with a friend. Let's just call her Masha. She was incredibly beautiful, always stylish, and one day she just casually admitted that her expensive life was paid for by a few lovers. I was just floored. I think I asked her something like, "How could you fall so low?" And she just looked at me with this pitying expression and hit me with that line. She didn't see herself as a victim at all.
And that's really the core question we're going to tackle here. How could her view of the world be so radically different from mine? To really understand where Masha was coming from, we can't just look at the here and now. The answer, it turns out, is buried in a long, very complicated, and often hidden history of paid love in Russia. So, let's get into it. To really get what's happening in Russia today, we have to rewind, way back to the time of the Tsars. Because you see, this is not some new thing, not even close. The same forces that create a market for paid sex today have been shaping Russian society for centuries.
So, in Tsarist Russia, the demand was just massive, and it was driven by a few powerful things. First, you had all these loveless, arranged marriages. Plus, wives were often unavailable because of the constant, very real dangers of childbirth. At the same time, the big cities were just flooded with migrant male workers, guys who were drivers, builders, waiters, who had left their families back in the villages. And then you throw in huge military garrisons, well, you've got a massive, ready-made customer base.
So in 1843, Tsar Nicholas I basically decided, okay, we can't ban this, so let's regulate it. And that was the yellow ticket system. It made prostitution legal, but it put it under this incredibly strict state control. The official idea was to contain what they called moral contagion, but what it really created was this giant bureaucracy of surveillance, corruption, and, frankly, exploitation.
But here's the thing. This system created these two completely separate worlds. At the very top, you had these elite parlors in St. Petersburg with velvet sofas and French champagne. And then at the bottom, you had these squalid dens where maybe 6 women were forced to share one room with straw mattresses and a single spittoon. I mean, they were two different universes existing in the same city.
And the scale of this was just enormous. By 1914, official records had about 50,000 registered prostitutes across the whole empire. But come on, that's only the women who were willing to go through those humiliating exams. Historians are pretty sure the real number was at least double that, once you factor in all the women working on the streets or as servants just trying to make rent.
Then, boom, the 1917 revolution happens, and this whole system gets swept away. The Bolsheviks show up with a brand new ideology, they abolish the yellow ticket, and they basically declare the problem solved. But what this created was this deep, deep paradox. The trade was officially erased, but it was thriving in the shadows, and sometimes it was even weaponized by the state itself.
So this was the official party line. According to communist ideology, prostitution was a disease of capitalism. So in their new workers' paradise, a society of equals, it just couldn't exist. It was ideologically impossible. The only problem was, reality didn't quite get the memo. Because on the ground, the story was totally different. Just 4 years after the revolution, in the middle of a brutal civil war and famine, it's estimated that 1 million women were earning a living by selling sex. For so many of them, their husbands were dead, their jobs were gone. It wasn't a moral choice. It was the only way they could feed their kid.
And here's where that paradox gets even darker. The state didn't just ignore it, they actively used it for their own ends. The secret police, the NKVD, and later the KGB, they formalized this whole system using what they called swallows. They'd recruit attractive women, dancers or actresses, and pay them in better food rations, roles, all kinds of privileges. Their mission? To charm foreign diplomats, report back on any pillow talk, and collect anything, love notes, photos, recordings, that could be used for blackmail.
Okay, so that's what was happening inside Soviet Russia. But what about the people who fled? Between 1917 and 1923, something like 2 million Russians escaped the Bolsheviks.
And for the women who got out, stripped of all their wealth and status, survival in a new country often meant facing the exact same desperate choices they thought they'd left behind.
Huge Russian communities popped up in cities all over the world. We're talking places like Constantinople, Shanghai, Berlin, and of course Paris. But when they arrived, their rubles were worthless, their fancy aristocratic titles were a joke, they basically showed up with nothing but the clothes on their backs.
For literally thousands of these women, survival meant turning to the night economy. Many had lost their husbands in the war, they didn't speak the local language, and they'd been raised to be wives and hostesses, not workers. So in places like Shanghai and Paris, you had former countesses and famous ballerinas selling themselves just to survive. It was like clinging to a plank over an economic abyss.
All right, let's hit the fast-forward button. We're jumping to the collapse of the Soviet Union. The absolute chaos of the 1990s unleashed this free market free-for-all, and the sex trade, which had been in the shadows for decades, just exploded out into the open. It went from a hidden practice to a full-blown commercial industry.
And there was this weird media fascination with it all. Books and movies about prostitutes became bestsellers, but that whole glamorous image, it was a complete fiction. The reality for most women who were pushed into the trade by massive layoffs was incredibly dangerous. It was a world run by racketeers, corrupt cops demanding bribes, and traffickers who would lure women abroad with promises of a better life and sell them into slavery.
Today, the industry is, well, it's incredibly segmented. You've got the whole spectrum. Everything from roadside workers catering to truck drivers, to bathhouse girls and these high-end escort services that pretend to be modeling agencies. And then at the absolute pinnacle, you've got the world of oligarchs and their mistresses, a whole lifestyle that gets flaunted all over social media.
And this is a really crucial point to understand about the culture. At the high end of this market, buying sex isn't seen as shameful. It's often just seen as a normal part of doing business or socializing. It's a status symbol, a way to show off your power and wealth. It is totally common for a group of guys to finish a business dinner by calling in some girls to continue the evening.
Which brings us right back to where we started, with my friend Masha in that cafe. When you look back through this whole history, her perspective starts to make a lot more sense. From the peasant girls in the Tsarist brothels to the Russian nobles in Shanghai and the women trying to survive the chaotic 90s, this world has never been simple. So what is it? A moral failing? A desperate strategy for survival? Or, like Masha saw it, a tool for gaining power in a world that gives you very few other options? The answer, it seems, has always been all of the above.